AMD wants in on the hot new microcomputer action. The GDC is born, and PCs are coming to rescue the arcade. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
What is up? It's me, Mario.
Please save me.
Welcome to the February 2019 episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl Kuros, and this month we're joined by our new co-host, Peter Ullman. Peter, say hi to the people out there.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, now Peter is going to be sort of our layman's eye view of the topics that we talk about here on the podcast. Now, Peter, you're a gamer, right?
Yes, I am. Since 1995.
Since 1995. So, he's a young one, okay?
Yeah, I was 5 years back then.
5 years old?
5
Jesus
years old.
Christ. Okay, so what we're dealing with here is now a slight generational shift, but what it also will hopefully do is provide an opportunity for Peter to ask questions and try to pull some explanations out of me for things that I take for granted that our listeners may not be as familiar with as me because they have a life. So Peter here is going to basically be the guy checking in to make sure that what I'm talking about isn't just a bunch of extremely nerdy insider jibbity-jab. Is that correct?
Hope so.
Okay. And hope so is all you can expect. Remember, you get what you pay for, people, and you didn't pay anything for this. So, okay. We're going to start our journey, as always, going back 40 years. That means February of 1979. Now, the really cool big thing I found for February of 1979 was an article from the New York Times. It ran in the February 25th issue, 1979. And it's a pretty interesting and detailed company profile of Advanced Micro Devices, also known as AMD.
The competitor of NVIDIA.
Today, best known as the competitor of NVIDIA. Now, throughout the history of home computing, AMD has been many things to many people. A lot of people out there, and myself included, still think of AMD as the company that competed with Intel making their compatible processors during the boom years of the IBM clone business in the late 80s, early 90s. They're basically the reason why Intel stopped using numbers and had to invent the term Pentium in order to copyright their chips. And this, though, is going back a way before that. So in 79, there's no IBM-compatible microcomputer yet. And remember, we're still using the term microcomputer because that differentiates it from a mainframe and a mini-computer. But AMD at this point was founded by former Fairchild salesman Jerry Sanders. And he was already a big producer of chips, having been a second sourcer. And now I had to look this up myself. A second source means that they manufactured other companies' products under license. This had included Intel chips in the past, and in 79 they were a second source for the Zilog Z80 processor. Now, the Zilog was the main processor for the UK computers of the 80s, such as the Spectrum and Amstrad, the Japanese MSX, and later on even Nintendo's Game Boy. So Sanders in this article is talking about the current state of the company. He says that they haven't really had the money to develop a line of chips of their own, partially because the development of the software environment and tools to use the proprietary system would have been cost prohibitive. Because if you're going to make a computer chip and a computer, you're going to have to make an operating system, you're going to have programming languages, all this stuff. That is big time investment. But instead, AMD found its niche by developing additional components for the microprocessors it was second sourcing. Interrupts, sequencers, memory, etc. Now, with the dawn of the microcomputer, remember, we've got the Commodore PET out there, the Apple II, and last month Atari just introduced their 8-bit line of computers. With the dawn of microcomputers, Sanders sees AMD's chance to break into the market. He doesn't say directly what his company's plans are. And this is something that the reporter from the New York Times should have pressed him on a little bit, but oh well. But it's hinted at that it might be a complete package microcomputer. No matter what it ends up being, it's clear that he sees the consumer market for computers as the next step after video games. Now, remember, he came from Fairchild. And for those of you not in the know, because, well, it's before this show started, and of course you get all your knowledge about computer and video gaming history from this show, Fairchild Semiconductor was the first company to make a video game system for the home with cartridges, even before the Atari 2600, the Fairchild Channel F.
And when was that?
The Channel F was launched in November of 1976, which was about a year before the Atari VCS, which would later get renamed to be the 2600. We've already got the Fairchild Channel F out there. Now, this is an extremely primitive piece of kit. And Fairchild was a company that was making semiconductors. They had no foothold before this in the consumer product category. And for them, this was a risky business. They never produced enough units to really be an impact on the market. Unlike the 2600, they never got around to having third-party development. All the games that were released for the Fairchild came from Fairchild themselves. Mm-hmm. And so this ended up being a bit of a problem in the long run.
And but wait a second. What kind of games did they actually make?
Oh, they made all sorts of stuff. You'd have tiny little sports simulations. I mean, you had your not directly Pong knockoffs, but Pong similar games. Hit the puck back and forth. You had some shooter games. You had racy car games. I mean, we're talking relatively low specs, but it could do color displays and stuff.
So not black screen, white cars or...
No. It wasn't a monochrome. It was a color system. It could do colors on the screen. Huh. And very, very primitive, but it was a video game system as we would define it today with programmable cartridges.
Which no one really bought.
No one really bought because there were never enough quantities in the stores, and the marketing muscle just wasn't there, sadly. Because Fairchild wasn't a consumer products manufacturer. They were making semiconductors, they were making chips, they were making components for big, massive computers, and they just weren't in this business. Now, the Fairchild alumni, the people who come out of Fairchild, are basically the founders of Silicon Valley. Intel, founded by Fairchild people, and so on and so forth. So without Fairchild, we don't have the computer industry as we know it today, and we probably don't really have the video game industry as we know it today. We're going back to Sanders. He's coming from Fairchild. Now, he wasn't a technician. He was a sales guy at Fairchild. But he understood what Fairchild had done, understood what Fairchild had created. And in this article, it becomes very, very clear that he sees the video game business as it currently exists with the Atari 2600, the Odyssey, which came out way before that, and so forth, as stepping stones to getting computers into the home. Because once you've created a video game system, you've got a CPU, you've got a GPU, even though these are very, very primitive and nobody's using those terms yet in this hardware. You've got outputs to the screen with discernible, movable objects. The home computer is basically just the next step, and he wants to be in on the ground floor. So here's a direct quote from the article. Sanders says, "The video game business, preceded by the CB radio business, preceded by the watch business, preceded by the calculator business, is littered with the broken bodies of defunct companies. There will be no littering from AMD." So just like we saw last month with Atari and Mattel, everyone seems to be writing video games off as another stepping stone to home computers and trying to figure out how to get in on that future business. They don't see video games as a standalone long-term business. They can't imagine a world where people would actually pay a lot of money for a device that only plays games when they can have a device that does everything in one. Of course, history tells us differently, but that's the status in '79 because nobody really knows this is a new market. And we've seen all these other technological fads come and go. Every time somebody comes up with a new gizmo, well, very quickly everybody replicates it, and very quickly it goes down in price. There's suddenly no market. It becomes a throwaway item. And they're probably thinking something similar is going to happen with video games. Obviously, in retrospect, the thing that they didn't expect is that one thing CB radios, calculators, and watches all had in common, and, well, Apple Watches, smart watches, we'll take those out of the equation for just a second. But what they all had in common was a limited functionality for that actual device. Once you could do all the multiplication tables and everything else for a calculator, you were done with the calculator. There was no other function. So you hit a limit of the functionality of the device, and then you could just make it cheaper.
Right. I mean, considering how the gaming industry is today, how big it is today, it really is astonishing that they thought back in the time that it wouldn't be that big of a deal later on. I mean, was there no one who had the idea of, okay, I'm just doing video games, and I am the one player who makes this tiny little thing right now, who makes it big?
Well, actually, that would have been Nolan Bushnell. For our listeners, if you go back to our November episode, Bushnell had his fight with the Atari board on exactly this ground. He thought, okay, the 2600 is a great little device, but we got to dump it and start with a new console right now because everybody else is getting better. We can keep going. He's basically arguing for console generation cycles. He doesn't know it. He probably didn't understand the concept. All he knew was this is too limited for the games of tomorrow to stay competitive. And the idea that it was going to remain a console and not morph into a computer, or that the computers would be a separate line of business next to the consoles, is something that the other people at Atari, and especially at Warner Brothers who were bankrolling Atari, the company was losing money at this point, dramatically. They couldn't see this development. They couldn't imagine that this thing would hold on. They were like, well, games basically look like games. You have to remember, it's 79. Yeah, games are getting better and better, but there isn't that much of a giant leap between the games in the arcades in 79, or 78 actually, and Pong. It hasn't changed that much. Most of the games are still black and white. Most of the games are just little bleeps and
considering
bloops.
the TVs you had back in the day.
Exactly. Well, the TV was the most expensive part of an arcade cabinet. People were afraid you'd steal the TV out of the cabinet.
No shit.
Of course. I mean, we're still talking about relatively expensive things, and these weren't tiny, tiny little screens because, well, people need to be able to see this stuff. So what we're really dealing with here is nobody really understands what they're dealing with yet. Nobody understands this industry because this industry is just in the birthing throes, okay? That first halfway decent sales Christmas for the Atari 2600 is just that, a first halfway decent sales Christmas. It isn't an industry yet. And at this point, there's no third-party publishers. All the games for any of the systems out there are being made by the same company that makes the hardware. So we cannot yet talk about an industry. And that's why they can't understand this. But they know computers are coming. Computers are cool. Computers are in the movies. Okay? 2001: A Space Odyssey. Everybody's talking about the computer. And now the computer's on its way. There's all these contenders in the market already. You want to be in on the computer revolution. This video game thing, it's child's play. It's kids' play.
Yeah, it's what parents buy for their kids.
Exactly.
And this is where the money is.
It's a Christmas item. And computers are going to be year-round item. Atari and Mattel are thinking this way. AMD is thinking this way. So AMD would go on to second source Intel's 8086 chip in 1979. So this is a little bit after this article. Probably the negotiations had already been ongoing. Now, the 8086 chip is sort of the precursor to what becomes the 286, 386, that entire line that is the heart and soul of the IBM compatible. They're already a second sourcer. Now, second source becomes extremely important because when IBM gets into the business of making PCs, their internal policy is we do not rely on just one provider for our components. Intel may be great. Intel may be reliable. But even they can have a disastrous fire at the factory or something. We need to have a second source. And that's where AMD comes in and where AMD learns how to make this chip and learns how to copy it.
So IBM was like, hey, Intel, give away your technology. And Intel was like, yep.
Not in so many words, but pretty much. If Intel wanted to have these kind of contracts with IBM, and IBM was and still is the 900-pound gorilla in this arena, you had to go along with this.
Did IBM have an alternative back in the days?
An alternative? You mean a
to
rival?
To Intel, yeah, to Intel. So
to
they would
Intel,
be like,
yeah.
I go to a competitor.
They could have used the Zilog. They could have used any number of MOS technologies is already around at this point. There's any number of different manufacturers for chips. Now, at this point, for this kind of calculation work, we're not talking big graphics or anything. Mm-hmm. We're just talking crunching numbers. Intel is probably the best one on the market. I don't know. I'd have to look and see if there's any other manufacturers out there. I'm not that familiar with that side of the industry. But Intel is basically one of the top of the line. And like I said, it's founded by Fairchild Semiconductor alumni. People who have come from Fairchild.
So you know each other, you know the people at IBM, you know the people at Intel, they know each other.
This is really where Silicon Valley starts taking off. They break out later in the 90s and make their own version of the chips and everything else. And then they get into graphics chips later on through the purchase of other companies like ATI, and that's how they actually get into the graphic chip process. They don't do it themselves. They just purchase somebody else who's already got the tech. Now, the really best part about this article, in my opinion, was this one line, and it echoes that beginning of the 80s ultra greed ethos that Oliver Stone caught so well in Wall Street, in the movie Wall Street. And it's a quote from Sanders. He says, "I care only about being rich and the success of advanced micro devices, in that order."
Well, at least he's honest.
He is honest, and he's onto something, and it really does encapsulate the kind of drive that would make AMD the chip maker and provider that it is today. So, I think that pretty much covers the AMD story. Let's move on to Atari Coin Connection, the Atari newsletter for arcade operators. Now,
those names, Xylon, Coin Collection, dude.
Not Xylon. Xylons were the bad guys in Battlestar Galactica. This is the Zilog. It was the Zilog Z80 processor.
All right, fair enough.
Okay, so now, in the Atari Coin Connection magazine, we get an account of an arcade in Dallas, Texas, that has done something revolutionary. It has started to accept credit cards for the purchase of tokens. Now, we've mentioned in a previous episode how they were monitoring the advances of arcades moving from quarters, from actual normal legal tender, to using tokens because of all the advantages. You can give discounts and so forth. And
to make people forget even more how much they were spending, they're using credit cards now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And,
wonderful.
And they're going to be doing it in denominations of $5 and going up to $20. And they're hoping the use of credit cards will increase spending habits the same way it is done in retail. And just to put this in perspective, remember, this is the time when credit cards are really starting to take off, at least in the United States.
So how can I imagine it? You give your teenager your credit card and be like, have a nice afternoon, go buy yourself some tokens?
Well, probably not quite that simple. The big thing here with the credit cards are that most credit cards in the U.S. at this point are still being run through these weird old machines where you would put it down and you would use carbon paper and you would rub across the carbon paper to grab the person's name and the card number and the expiration date. That's why they were always emboldened. Yeah, you're old enough probably still to remember ATM cards and credit cards that had the numbers and the letters jetted out of the plastic, right?
Yeah, it's still like that.
No, my credit card doesn't have that anymore. Now it's just all flat. Well, okay, yeah. Say, kids today not up to a day on the tech. Well, the reason it was done that way was when you ran a credit card, even though there was a magnetic strip on the back, most places didn't have a card reader hooked up to a telephone line. So they would actually run it through this machine that would press down on it through carbon paper, so they would then be able to put the amount that you charged on it, give you a receipt for what you charged on the credit card, and then at the end of the month they would send their receipt into the credit card company to be able to be reimbursed for the amount of product that they gave you. The fact that this arcade wants to do it, I don't know if they're actually running the paper version or if they're now hooked up with a telephone line, but this idea of digital communication over telephone lines. And we saw it also in a previous episode with the first interactive television services are coming out in America at this time. It's in the air. Everybody knows we're going to be communicating digitally using computer signals over telephone lines. We know it's coming.
The future is now.
Exactly. The movie War Games is only a couple years away at this point, okay? Matthew Broderick will bring about the apocalypse. You've never seen War Games?
No, of course I haven't.
Christ. Kids today. Kids today.
Dude, I'm 30 years old. Kids.
Goddamn whippersnappers. Okay, so it's in the air. We know the digital revolution is coming. And the idea of using the credit cards for this is quite cool. Of course, this is also in the middle of an economic downturn. Everybody in the United States, in the newspapers at the time, are talking about the recession. It's coming, it's here, and it will have effects with, like, for example, Jimmy Carter losing the election in 1980.
Wonderful. So go on, use your credit card, dudes.
Exactly. That's what we're promoting. If you can't afford the coins yourself, well, just put it on credit. Plastic is just as good. In other interesting news from the newsletter this month, Atari adds a little cut-out fill-out form asking arcade operators to tell them about any legal restrictions on coin-operated gaming in their areas.
And the headline was, you want us to lobby for you?
Pretty much. Basically what they wanted them to do is let them know if any kind of local restrictions are coming in on games. This is a time when you still had a lot of grandfathered in restrictions based off of pinball being a gambling thing and other restrictions on arcade operating hours. Atari apparently wanted to see. I did a little bit of research into this. I couldn't find any mentions of Atari doing any actual lobbying work or getting involved in any kind of lawsuits or legal cases surrounding this.
Did the good lobbying.
Well, maybe it was the really good lobbying. Yes, we were all playing video games, so apparently whatever they did worked. But they were trying to avoid the certain types of location restrictions, player age restrictions, special or extraordinary taxes on coin-operated games. These are all the things listed in the fill-out form. So it was pretty interesting to see that.
Can't use your dad's credit card? Come to us.
We'll lobby to make sure that every 8-year-old can walk in with daddy's credit card and buy all the tokens he wants to play Death Race. Yes. Oh, well. So, that concludes our news for 1979. Let's turn on the time machine and move forward to February 1989. Now we are in February 1989. And let's start looking at the big stories. On the computer front, Dragon's Lair is finally coming to 16-bit computers. ReadySoft of Canada is releasing the game on 6 discs, and it'll cost £44.95.
That's not too bad, man.
Yeah, except that if you account for inflation and, well, the pound has dropped a lot over the last 30 years, that comes out to that too. That comes out to £111 in modern equivalent. Or, if we wanted to put it into dollar terms, $143 in modern terms.
So, Dragon's Lair equals 2 games from today. Ish.
2 plus, yes. 2 plus a couple of DLC packs. Or if you're talking EA games, enough to be able to play for about a month before you're just noobed out and need more loot crates. So it's hard to really understand nowadays how big of an event this was. We're talking 6 years after Dragon's Lair was released in the arcades, Laserdisc game. We had gotten ports on the 8-bit computers that were, well, more or less playable, sprite-based recreations. Basically, yeah, they were kind of terrible in many ways.
Festival for the eye.
Yes, but we played them nonstop back then, even though we kept dying and dying and dying, because Dragon's Lair was so important. Let me put it in perspective. We had Dragon's Lair, produced by the legendary Don Bluth, as a Laserdisc game for the arcades, and then we had a Saturday morning cartoon show based off of it as well. That's how big Dragon's Lair was.
The cartoon show looked like the game in the arcade.
No, it was actually made by a really cheap and really crappy
so
Rankin
the cartoon
Bass.
show was way worse than the actual game.
The cartoon show looked terrible. I mean, I watched it religiously as a kid. There weren't a lot of episodes, but I watched it religiously. And even though it didn't look as good as the arcade, it at least felt like it was the same thing. And they had this gimmick where every time they went to a commercial, it would be a cliffhanger. Is Dirk gonna die? And then when they came back, they'd be like, well, if he did this, he'd die. If he did this, he'd die. But he did this. And they would keep playing it that way. So it gave you that feeling of the interactivity of the arcade without having to drop a ton of quarters in it.
So it's basically the other way around. The game is good and the movie is crappy.
Wait, how is that different from any other adaptation of video games that we've seen so far?
Yeah, but did you ever play a good adaptation of a film as a video game?
Oh, see, you're too young to remember the glory days of movie adaptations when they still had, Batman the movie by Ocean, RoboCop, Lethal Weapon.
Yeah, sorry, I'm the Harry Potter generation, so...
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you guys did kind of get the short end of the stick on that one. I hate to break it to you. No, there was a brief moment in time when, yes, we still had a lot of bad movie adaptations, but we also had a slew of amazing movie adaptations. Where movies could be the inspiration for some great creativity in games. Unfortunately, however, that has gone the way of the dodo. And in addition to that, the modern, and this could be a diatribe for its own day. Maybe we'll have to do extra episodes of diatribes on topics outside of our normal format. But most game publishers just don't want to deal with licenses anymore because the license will fade, and in a day and age when you have online distribution and you got to take a game down, well, that kind of hurts you. You don't want to lose that license. So, okay. But no, we did have good ones in the past. A lot of them were garbage. Just try booting up Street Hawk or Knight Rider for an 8-bit computer and know what pain is. But yes, there have been good ones in the past. In this case, though, yeah, the TV show, it's probably terrible to look at nowadays. I haven't gone back to it in 20 years. But it's definitely something that kept the brand alive, kept the memory of Dragon's Lair far more alive than the arcade would have. And, of course, as a little side note, and we'll probably get to that in a few years when the game does come out and we have to report on it, it was the first arcade game where 50 cents was the normal price to charge for it. But
well, that's an increase.
Hey,
you want to have double, just double.
And they went from dimes to quarters. I mean, from 10 cents to 25 cents back in the 60s. Now, that was inflation. But what are you going to do? Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that they're translating the game not as a weird sprite-based adaptation, action game adaptation, but trying to do a one-to-one of the quick-time event style gameplay of the Laserdisc. Again, 6 3.5-inch floppy disks at the time, just an unbelievable amount of data. We're talking nearly 10 megs of game.
Wow. Wow.
Oh,
And
children.
How did it work? Was it like, all right, you're on this section and now change the disc?
Yes.
So this guy would just pause on the screen and you would just put in the other disc.
Basically, they would show you a still image of Dirk and with your current score and tell you... trying to remember. I remember vividly how it was for Space Ace, one of the sequel games, where they actually had the bad guy Borf holding a floppy, and the number of the floppy you had to put in was on the disc.
Okay.
But we were kind of used to that. Changing out discs back in the day was a fairly common sight. So yeah, they would just tell you, put in the next disc, and you put in the next disc, and then if you died, you'd have to put in the first disc again to be able to start the game from the start.
And if you want to start at level 5, you just put in disc number 5.
No. They were smarter than that. You always had to start from disc 1. But this is why we had 2 disc setups. So, I mean, you got around it a little bit. But yeah, this was a huge deal. We'd get a slew of these games over the next few years. We'd get Dragon's Lair would get divided up into 2 games, just like the 8-bit versions had. So it was Dragon's Lair and Dragon's Lair 2, Escape from Sing's Castle, Space Ace 2, Revenge of Borf, although that one was kind of new scenes animated just for the computer games. And then the arcade sequel, Dragon's Lair 2 Time Warp, would also get split into 2 games for the home.
So what they do today as DLC, they just did there with the sequels.
Pretty much. We had also our version of DLC back then, mission packs and level maps and things like that. One of the great ones in the past was Powermonger World War I Edition, where they took this proto real-time strategy game set in a medieval world, and then the add-on disc, which still required the original disc, turned everything into Europe World War I. So it was kind of cool. I gotta say, that was one of the better ones. But yes, that's what we're dealing with here. 16-bit, full screen, animated graphics. You felt like you were watching a cartoon, and it was only going to cost you a small fortune. Okay, so let's move on from there. Some other interesting news coming out in the European computer market. There's the big headline, 120-pound supercomputer is on its way. Now, this is coming from Crash Magazine. This was a Spectrum magazine out of the UK.
That's pretty cheap.
It would have been cheap. 120? Hell, that's only three copies of Dragon's Lair. And what they're talking about is that Miles Gordon Technology, or MGT, is a manufacturer of computer peripherals at this point, primarily for the Spectrum. And they're talking about releasing a new 8-bit computer, the SAM. Now, just to put the scenario for those of you not familiar, the Spectrum was such a low-budget home computer that you needed a lot of peripherals just to make the thing work. It had no joystick ports. It had no real connectors for things like disk drives and cassette tapes and everything. The ports that it had were so basic that you needed additional hardware adapters for almost anything on this machine. Now,
so the thing actually wasn't that cheap.
It wasn't
you bought
that
everything
cheap.
that you actually
No.
need, you still end up with, what was it, 200, 300 pounds?
Probably not that much, especially by 89. Now, by 89, the Sinclair Spectrum had already gone through a lot of changes. Sinclair himself had sold the brand off to Amstrad. Amstrad was manufacturing an all-in-one unit, the Spectrum Plus 2 and the Plus 3 lines. So you didn't have this peripheral business anymore. So you can imagine that these guys are seeing their market dwindle because there's no point to their product anymore. Anybody buying a new Spectrum doesn't need their stuff any longer. But what they're also seeing is that slowly but surely the 8-bit market in Europe is dying. Obviously. It's 89. People want to move on. You can't get away with this color clash of the Spectrum and things like that anymore. So what are you going to do? You're going to desperately hold on to the past and hope and pray that it works.
Did it?
No. Sorry, spoiler alert. No, it didn't. So what were they suggesting? Well, the SAM, later renamed the Sam Coupe upon release, would be an all-in-one unit with a built-in 3.5-inch disk drive, but unlike similar designs from Commodore and Atari, which Commodore Amiga 500 and the Atari ST both had the built-in drives, the SAM would not be built around the 16-bit 68000 chipset. but instead use the Z80B processor, and a step up from the Spectrum and Amstrad lines. It would also emulate the Spectrum's color clash prone graphic mode for backward compatibility. Sadly, due to timing issues in the emulation, a lot of the software would not work, and the memory map of the 128K Spectrums, which is the ones Amstrad was releasing, could also not be emulated.
So it had backwards compatibility, which did not work.
It had backwards compatibility with the most basic older software, but anything pretty much produced the last 2 or 3 years before the Sam Coupe came out was not going to work.
We're backwards compatible with only...
Yes. Yeah, and remember, they're using a Z80 processor. Basically, they're trying to sell you a computer that runs on the same hardware as the Game Boy.
Wow.
And in the same year, the Game Boy is coming out.
Size is better.
Bigger is better, apparently, yes. Add a keyboard to it and everything's great. The Sam Coupe would launch in '89, but it would come out so late that it missed the Christmas shopping season, and it also failed to hit the promised £120 price point, instead retailing, according to Retro Gamer, for $169.95. When comparing that with similar machines at the time, a Commodore 64 with a heavy software bundle could be had for £150.
So they had 2 goals, and they achieved none of them.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Good start.
And it gets worse, because the 16-bit systems like the ST and the Amiga, the ones that are basically miles and miles ahead of this thing, were going for about £350. So a little bit more than double, you were getting 5 times the machine. So yes, this was cheaper, but still not quite up to speed with what was quickly becoming a 16-bit world. Now, MGT would file for bankruptcy the next year after being stuck with a lot of inventory. They originally hoped to sell 56,000 units the first year and only managed a lifetime sales number of 12,000.
Which still, I think it's a considerable number.
Well, it's a considerable number, but when you consider how many Spectrums had been sold and the number of people who were desperate for a continuation of that line, the hardcore people, it's not all that surprising, especially because they had moved up to a disk drive. Most of the Amstrad systems were still being sold with cassette drives. So the idea of a Spectrum that was using disks was a huge, huge improvement over having to wait for 12 minutes for your damn game to load. And yes, it would take that and more, sadly, from cassette. You poor children, you don't know what you were missing. Granted, okay, I was an American Commodore 64 user, so I never actually owned a cassette drive either. So sorry, English listeners, I can't really feel your pain. But I worked in a store where I used to have to make copies of games onto cassette, and having to sit there for 3 hours while I'm dumping games on there,
Sounds like an awesome job.
Oh, it was. Oh, well. It paid for more games, so that's all that really mattered.
Time to read books.
Where do you think I got all this knowledge about video gaming? I used to read the magazines cover to cover multiple times during this. Oh, well. But, yeah, so the Sam Coupe, the rights for the Sam Coupe would wander for the next few years until the platform was abandoned. So different companies would buy up the inventory, sell off a few more, sell off here, but never really went anywhere. Now, there's a news blurb in the same issue of Crash, also talking about the Sam Coupe. It's kind of weird. They had this big article about it at the back of the magazine, but at the front of the magazine they had a little news blurb about it, and they were talking about the computer retailing in a driveless form, so without the built-in drive, for £150. And £220 with a drive. Now, of course, this flies in the face of £120 with a drive, which is what they were promising in the back issue. My guess is that the news blurb in the front of the magazine was written last minute. So they put that together at the very end of the magazine. The articles in the back were probably written a month or two earlier. And they just didn't bother going back and rewriting it. They just thought, okay, we got the news blurb in the front. That's it.
We've already written it.
And we got the typesetting done. This is before everything's done on a computer. They're not going to have to go out with scissors and redo this. And so the idea of the 150 or 220 pound version, 220 would have just been ridiculous. But as far as I can tell, looking at some research, the only version that was actually released was the one with a built-in drive. So we never got the 150-pound cheap version, apparently. The world is so sad for that.
Yeah.
Oh, well. Okay, so the Sam Coupe, c'est la vie. Now, leaving Europe for just a moment, let's look to the Far East in Japan. Last couple months we've been talking about how the Sega Mega Drive had launched in Japan. We still haven't seen the sales numbers, but it probably doesn't look too shabby. But Nintendo's not just going to let that slide. So Nintendo wants to show that they're still in the game. So there is an official unveiling of the Super Famicom. And it surprises the world with backward compatibility and a very impressive looking flight game called Dragonfly.
Wonderful.
Oh, yes. Well, now, looking at the pictures, Dragonfly is clearly Pilot Wings. One of the launch titles for the Super Nintendo.
Which was my first console ever.
Your first console?
My first console, yeah.
Oh, you poor. No, I shouldn't say that. The Super Nintendo, amazing system, great games.
I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, and I still go back to it on a fairly regular basis.
F-Zero.
Let's face it. Mario Kart.
Yep. Wonderful game.
Super Mario Kart, the first time I played that, I was super impressed. Oh, sorry. Contra 3, The Alien Wars. That is also...
Bless you.
So, you've never played... Oh, no, you would have known it as
Dude,
Probotector.
I was 5 years old.
You would have known it as Probotector.
Yeah, my parents bought these games for me, so...
Oh, yeah, you weren't getting a copy of Probotector.
I played a weird soccer game, which was pretty awful.
Well, and there may be a reason why the soccer game was awful. Now, see, this backward compatibility story apparently was going to happen through an adapter, similar to the way that the Sega Mega Drive was backward compatible with the Master System through an adapter. But the adapter wasn't really, the emulator wasn't really the hardware. What was going on in the Mega Drive was that you had a Z80 processor on the motherboard and basically a recreation of the Master System hardware inside the Mega Drive, which no doubt raised the cost of manufacturing the Mega Drive, but it allowed for this backward compatibility. Nintendo was thinking the same thing, and there's speculation that this is the reason why they decided to go with the 6502 derivative chip for the Super Nintendo. Now, the 6502 is a similar chip to the Apple II back in the 70s, the Commodore 64, the VIC-20.
So we have this new console. What do we want to put in? A chip from the 1970s. Wonderful.
Well, but in all fairness, the 6502 was also the type of chip that they used in the NES. It was something that the programmers knew how to use, and it would allow for easy backward compatibility. And in the historical context, this is the first time the 8 to 16-bit console generation changeover, the first big console cycle since the American crash in the 80s, was a time nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody understood that gamers would be willing to trade in their games, also something that didn't exist yet, the concept of trading in your games. If you did get rid of your old games, you had to sell them at a garage sale or sell them to some kind of used store or a pawn shop. And nobody really understood that people would be willing to give up their old games and buy brand new ones. They were all afraid of this backward compatibility issue, and Nintendo seems to be hedging their bets here, hoping that, well, will entice you to buy the Super Nintendo because you can still play your old games. And which you couldn't at the end of the day. And this is my speculation. I have found nothing on this. If anybody has any hard facts on this, I would love to see them. My speculation is that they saw that it very quickly turned out not to be a selling point for the Genesis, that it was backward compatible. And thus they decided it did not pay off to add additional costs to the Super Nintendo to make it backwards compatible. So they abandoned it, but by then it was already too late. By then they had already set themselves up with the 6502 processor and they had to keep going with it. And ultimately, for most of the games, the Super Nintendo did not suffer in any way. That this processor wasn't as fast as some other processors like the 68000 series, which was at the core of the Mega Drive. Instead, they just relied on the extra chips, things like the Mode 7 chips and the very, very good sound chip that was in the Super Nintendo. But they would also add chips and extra boosters into the cartridges. This is why...
Which made them so expensive.
Which made them so expensive. But this is also why Super Mario Kart could do split screen, whereas F-Zero could only do one-player gameplay.
It was marvelous. Playing on this small-ass TV and split screen. Sitting right in front of it.
You have never played Hired Guns on an Amiga 500. That's all I have to say. I'll show you a video of it sometimes. Anybody out there, if you haven't played Hired Guns, and I did mention it last episode, and I will probably mention it many, many times again because it's just that good. Hired Guns on the Amiga. I'll show you what it looked like, and then you will weep and weep for us poor souls who wasted our lives in front of small screens. So... what I'm trying to say here is they probably saw that it wasn't going to be a big selling point for them, and they just dropped it. But by then, the decision had been made, and they would keep upping it. But it also meant the 6502 couldn't move as many sprites as other chips, and this made soccer games, football games, and other sports titles less clean on the Super Nintendo. They didn't move as smoothly, and this really gave the Mega Drive / Genesis in the United States a huge leg up in that market, especially because sports games were such a big deal. When EA went to a yearly model for their sports games, the Mega Drive was the place to go for your FIFA, for your Madden, for your NBA Live, and so forth. Something that Super Nintendo just couldn't do. It was great for your fun little jump and run games as long as there weren't too many sprites on the screen.
And the racing game F-Zero. Wonderful game.
Of course.
Wonderful game.
Wonderful game, no doubt about it. And probably the reason why something like a Super NES Mini today has such a strong ability to sell in comparison with, for example, a Mega Drive, is that we've seen better iterations of those sports games over the years. We don't have to go back to 95, 96, 97, or let's say 89, 91, 92, whatever. We don't have to go back to the 16-bit generation of those games to experience that type of gameplay. But a game like F-Zero, a game like Super Mario World, a game like Super Metroid, these are the absolute classics. They're timeless, and they did everything right. Although I will say, give me Castlevania Symphony of the Night any day of the week. That's the 2D platformer of choice for me. But oh well, another issue for another time. Okay, so our last bit of news out of Japan. This is actually coming from an English magazine, so it was probably delayed, but it was just an image that was too great not to mention, was that a new bike racing game called Top Rider is getting an amazing new peripheral, namely an inflatable bike that you can sit on. And now the magazine is speculating that you control the bike with this inflatable bike. Unfortunately, and you can please look up on YouTube, there's some great videos of people playing this thing. The tilt function isn't really a tilt function for left and right. You still control left and right with the handlebars in the game. So
you could do a wheelie, though.
You can do a wheelie, yes.
You can do a wheelie.
But for the most part, it's not what we would have hoped for. It wasn't Super Hang-On from the arcades. Super Hang-On, for those not in the know, Yu Suzuki racing game, 1984, 85-ish, and you actually sat on a life-sized fiberglass motorcycle. The screen was built into what would have been the little window in the front, and you saw your bike from the back, and you controlled it by leaning. From the back. You saw your bike from the back.
Sit on the bike, and you see in your front window the bike in the back.
We're still dealing with Sega's superscalar technology at this point. Doing it first person would not have been an option. But you controlled the bike by leaning left and right on this fiberglass bike.
So this was what my butt looks like when I'm on a bike. Wonderful, wonderful.
All I have to say is I wish my butt looked that good from behind, okay?
Were there female characters?
No. Tomb Raider would give us that final option,
Wonderful.
but we're still a few years off, sadly. Okay, and finally, let's go to the United States, where there's a big event happening. Namely, the very first Game Developers Conference has been held and is being reported on in Computer Gaming World magazine. Now, GDC, which is still a huge event today, gets started by Chris Crawford. For those of you who have never played one of his games, and that's the vast majority of people, he was a game developer in the early 80s. Most famous probably for Balance of Power, which was a global strategy game where you controlled one of the two superpowers and had to basically manipulate other countries and manipulate one another, invest resources and so forth. Phenomenal game. But
learn how to do Cold War.
Exactly. It was the Cold War. It was the Cold War
simulator.
And actually, he was one of the first guys to release the same game with updates for the geopolitical situation.
Really?
Yeah, so it wasn't yearly, but he'd release a new version of it with the year tacked on, so you could actually play the current status of the world, so to speak.
And the game ended in 1990?
Something like that, and then it got going again afterwards.
Now?
Yeah. Are you just saying that we're living through a reboot right now? I'm not trying to get political here, but oh wow, we are. Okay, so but Chris Crawford had become an evangelist of game design. He had a very, very popular newsletter that was going out to game developers.
Podcast.
It was yesterday's podcast, very true. And so at the very first GDC, he's got 150 game developers showed up to hear panels on a variety of subjects. Interesting to note is that companies like HP, Hewlett-Packard, have reps giving speeches showing them that multimedia hardware business sees gaming as an important area for their growth. Now, this is 1989. We're not really in the era of the PC compatible as the major game platform yet.
And 10 years earlier, everyone was like, games, whatever.
Exactly. So we're dealing here with a time period when a major company like HP that's just now really making inroads into the home market is saying, hey, wait, games, this is going to be big for us. So I would go out on a limb and say they knew VGA cards are going to be our next big seller. The Sound Blaster, not Sound Blaster, sorry, that's still a little ways off, but the AdLib card is gaining ground. We need to get these guys on our side. We need to get them making games. We need them to develop for the multimedia revolution. And so what we're really looking at here in this first GDC is a game plan of how the industry is trying to determine its future. Things like storytelling and NPC interaction gets a lot of attention in the presentations, and Crawford calls it the challenge of the 1990s. And
Some call it the challenge of today.
And curiously enough, it is still the breaking point of most games. I mean, come on, there's a reason why it's become a meme to say, I was an adventurer until I took an arrow to the knee. This whole idea of having a game world where you don't really feel like you're interacting with anybody is still a problem in game development. Online games have changed that, but not because the programmers have finally cracked AI or at least immersion in the games.
They just surrendered and be like, let's open it for people.
Exactly. I mean, they're just basically saying, screw it, you guys just want to play with each other, it's all okay. And so, in a way, what they're doing here is trying to tackle a problem that is still with us today. And as somebody who loves sitting through long, boring lectures on YouTube from GDC events, this was a very interesting thing to see how this conference started. And of course, there's the iconic image of Chris Crawford in his weird little blue farmer shirt holding up a bullwhip, which is for many, many years was like the image of Chris Crawford. Very, very cool to see. So, and it's also interesting to see just how many people showed up to this very first GDC. This did not start in, some guy's basement, as so many other things like comic book conventions and stuff tend to do. This actually started out as a major, well-organized machine. Okay, that's it for 1989. That wraps it up here. Let's turn on the time machine and make our final jump to February of 1990. Welcome to February of 1999. So, first let's start off in Japan. We talked about how the Dreamcast was launched in December there, and Next Generation Magazine is reporting on the first sales numbers. It looks like Sega has sold through their 150,000 units shipped in Japan, and that Virtua Fighter 3 TB has sold at an almost 1-to-1 rate with the consoles. Now, the Virtua Fighter 3 TB, amazing port of the arcade game, and Virtua Fighter's popularity in Japan cannot be overstated. This is a country that is absolutely obsessed with this game, which in the rest of the world has a lukewarm following at best.
Any idea why?
My guess is that it's far more technical than the other games. Mortal Kombat basically lives off the fact that it's gory as hell. Street Fighter is this pixel-perfect jump around and do stuff game. Tekken is also, I wouldn't call it technical, but is more of a fun game. And Virtua Fighter is a game that almost has a Zen-like quality in the way that the combos and the connections between moves work. Something that just appeals to the Japanese mindset of, I must find that perfect moment type of thing.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's why Virtua Fighter has always been the king of the castle in Japan ever since it was first introduced. And so it's selling 1-to-1. Basically, the Dreamcast is bought by people who play Virtua Fighter to play Virtua Fighter, and according to the sales numbers, not much else. Of all the launch titles, there's a game called July. That was the worst performer in the launch titles and only sold 12,000 units. And there weren't that many launch titles. I think it's 5 titles altogether.
12,000 during the lifetime, or
12,000 during the launch window.
Well, it's 10%, not too bad.
It's 10%, but it's only 1 out of every 10. If you only got like 5 games out there, that's...
Okay.
You were expecting more on launch day. People are coming in with a wad of cash. You're thinking, okay, they're going to try to buy as many of the games as they can, or at least 2 or 3 games. That's not a good sign. So
they bought Virtua Fighter 3 TB.
They did buy Virtua Fighter 3, and unfortunately...
You have to buy something, don't you?
Unfortunately for Sega, a lot of people would actually stop after that and not buy too much else. The Dreamcast was, while very well remembered by many people, and an amazing console that gave us some amazing experiences. I mean, anybody who actually played Seaman back in the day, that Seaman back in the day, will know what I'm talking about. But yes, we'll see how it performs as we go forward. But Next Gen compares this to the lackluster 1994 launch of the Sega Saturn, where Virtua Fighter 1 was the only real highlight of the Japanese launch, and that was actually a sore disappointment because it was such a poorly rushed job that they actually had to follow it up with a remastered version of Virtua Fighter 1 just about a year later. But that's the Dreamcast launch in Japan.
Yeah. I've actually never played Dreamcast.
You've never played a Dreamcast? Oh. It's one of the most awkward and terrible controllers known to man.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
But
you need an extra hand or so.
Well, no. That's the N64. No, the Dreamcast was just awkwardly shaped, but the console itself, because they couldn't rely on a lot of third parties, had some of the most innovative gameplay, and also it was the first console that shipped with a built-in modem. So it actually had a lot of interesting multiplayer online game experiences. So Phantasy Star Online probably being the most recognizable, but then you also had what some people consider the first truly open world game, Shenmue, also arrived for the system. Dreamcast, a system that had so much potential, and unfortunately timing and bad Sega management in previous products kind of made it an ill-fated system. But, oh well. On to other news. Also coming out of Japan, the end numbers are streaming in on the arcade business year for 1998. Apparently, Japan's arcade game exports dropped a whopping 18.1% in that year.
I'm actually surprised that the arcade was still alive in 1999.
Oh, well, we have to put this in a little bit of context. Now, the home business, the home console business had been growing bigger and bigger. The PlayStation was a huge boon to it by making older gamers interested in this. There's a reason why the launch advertisements in the United States featured the dominatrix character from Battle Arena Toshinden on all the merchandise. Mm-hmm. Because, well, they were going for that older audience. And coming in now 4 or 5 years later, you were still seeing that older audience continue on with gaming. The arcades were, though, still the place you could go for top-of-the-line, cutting-edge graphics and big experiences that you couldn't get at home. We just saw it here with 150,000 Dreamcast sold, so you could play an almost one-to-one arcade-perfect version of Virtua Fighter. Now, this is going to be part of our story going forward, that the edge the arcade had in graphics is starting to be taken in. If you played an arcade fighting game and then you went home and bought the port, it was never going to be quite as good. If you played, for example, the Capcom fighting games like Street Fighter vs. X-Men, where you could switch out characters willy-nilly, you couldn't do that in the PlayStation version because the PlayStation just didn't have enough memory for all that. Or you were losing frames of animation, which would also screw up your timing in the fighting. The idea of an arcade-perfect fighting game at home was really still just a pipe dream. No matter how good the ports had been, they were not quite up to speed of what an arcade game cabinet could produce at this time. With this, we're actually seeing the death of the arcade in many ways, and it comes because companies like Sega and Capcom are feeling the pinch, and they're starting to downsize the hardware that they're using. We talked about it last month. Sega is promoting now the Naomi board, which is basically just a slightly souped-up version of the Dreamcast as their new arcade platform. And this is going to produce some amazing games like House of the Dead 2 and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. The only problem is, though,
you could play it at home as well.
It's not going to be long before you get it at home. And once you have it at home, well, do I really need to go to the arcade? Crazy Taxi, another amazing title. Yes, it has the force feedback steering wheel and everything in the arcade, but I can get the exact same game plus extra bonus levels and extra bonus activities on the home version. And yeah, okay, I'll miss the steering wheel probably, but I'll also get by with a controller.
And I don't have to pay, like, what did you have to pay at this time for a game in the arcade?
At this point in the arcades, you're probably paying 50 cents on average for new games.
So $2 on Dragon's Lair.
If you're adjusting for inflation, yes, $2 on Dragon's Lair. Some of the older titles are 25-cent games. Around this time, I was still visiting an arcade at a mall in the town I was living at. I was quite passionate about playing the Capcom fighting games. I was playing a lot of Marvel vs. Capcom 1, as well as the occasional Darkstalkers game. Those were already set to 25 cents, but if I wanted to play any of the racing games, which were quite popular, such as Cruisin' World, Crazy Taxi. Oh, and there was an absolutely amazing game that was made on the predecessor hardware to the Naomi board, Gunblade New York.
Also a racing game?
No, this was a shooter game where you were in a helicopter flying around New York. blowing stuff up with a giant gun. And I mean, this thing was huge. And it had force feedback. And after about 5 minutes of just pressing the button and it shaking your entire body, you couldn't feel your thumbs anymore. And it was the most amazing experience. House of the Dead 2, another great one. Blowing up zombies, blowing out their guts and stuff. It was amazing feats in the arcades around this time. This in the next year or so. But yeah, you were paying about $50. I mean, you went in with $10 in your pocket. The $10 was gone fairly quickly. And suddenly paying $60 to have the game at home made a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I wouldn't go into an arcade. No.
No.
I wouldn't go. Like, if I have the option of, inviting a couple of friends home to my place home, and we play it at home.
No, you're missing the entire experience of the arcade. Was you'd bump into people there, or you'd go to the arcade right after or right before going to the movies, or you'd stop by the food court in the mall, grab something. I mean, granted, these were teenage activities or young adult activities, but this was just one more stop on an evening of entertainment. And also you had the other things there that you couldn't get at home, like pinball, for example, or air hockey were also common activities in the arcades at this time. And this is also a great era for pinball. Pinball is really hitting its stride at this point with tables like Medieval Madness, Attack from Mars, Indiana Jones, one based off the trilogy, the Williams table, not the one that included the Crystal Skulls by Stern a decade later. Yeah, okay, we can go into pinball too, but we're trying to keep it somewhat limited here on the podcast. So there was more than just the video games there. Okay. And also there's something to be said for having the light gun that you didn't have at home. A game like Time Crisis that would combine a foot pedal and a light gun with force feedback. That was just an experience you weren't going to be able to get at home.
Right. Worth the premium of 25 cents.
Worth a premium of 25 cents. These were not games that you were going to spend 50 hours on. I mean, hell, if you were really, really good and could play them all the way through, they'd probably be done in 20 minutes. So this is why. And you even had stuff where you had to ride a plastic horse with multiple pieces on it. And
in an arcade. Yeah.
In an arcade. This is why. It's
How to make a moron out of yourself.
And this is all before Dance Dance Revolution came out. That's a few years yet in the future. Okay, so we're looking at the arcades. Arcade sales are down. Sega's pushing hardware that you can buy at home. What is an arcade operator or an arcade manufacturer supposed to do? Well, to our rescue comes the idea of the arcade PC. Now, you have to also put this into context. The PC in 1999 is basically the juggernaut of hardware. We've been sitting with the PlayStation for 4 or 5 years now. Sega Saturn's dead. The N64 has some great game experiences, but it looks basically what a fourth grader's color splotches looks like to somebody with cataracts because it's so undefined and unsharp. But the PC has their massive 3D accelerated cards, their 800 by 600 resolution, or if you're really, really got the money, you can buy a card that can already put out 1024 by 768 resolutions. They've got tons and tons of RAM in there. The online gaming space is taking off. Remember, the Dreamcast won't launch in the United States for another year. So from a U.S. standpoint, consoles are stuck with no online connectivity. So we got massively multiplayer online games coming into vogue. We've got Quake online. We've got Duke Nukem online. We've got Unreal Tournament. There's a whole world of gaming on the PC that is so many light years ahead of what consoles can do. The idea of making a console hardware-based arcade game just seems antiquated. It seems behind the times. So why not use this advanced PC architecture to build arcade games? And this is where the arcade PC idea comes from. And this is also the time period when the PC Master Race concept comes into being. And there's a whole bunch of companies, primarily American companies, that are jumping on this bandwagon. We've got Lasertron. They're already a pretty big name in Redemption Prize games. And they're licensing PC titles like Quake and Actua Soccer and a game called The Reap, which I had to look up, was a Swedish-developed isometric action shooter game, sort of like a 3D real-time rendered version of Zaxxon. Completely forgettable. And they're thinking that they can put these games, tweak them slightly, put them in an arcade cabinet, and everything will be okay. I tried to look up and see what came of all this. They got a couple of units out there, but it went nowhere. Then we got Midwest Amusement Corporation. They team up with NEC Electronics. Now, NEC at this point is the owner of the Power VR chipset. This was one of the many 3D chipset platforms of the time, together with the Voodoo chip cards from 3DFX and others, that was vying for control of the market. It's also the chipset used in the Dreamcast and Naomi boards. And they were trying to find a way to incorporate all this tech into an arcade PC as well. I couldn't find any exact games released through this deal, and there were a couple different companies using the Midwest Amusement trademark, so I honestly can't tell you if anything came of this deal. And finally, there's Ferris Productions. Now, this was a company that made VR arcade games. You got to imagine this is also the time when VR was still a little bit of a catchphrase. It was starting to die down after the first big push in the early 90s. But in places like Six Flags, a big amusement park chain, they would have areas with arcades, but they would also have these areas with VR experiences where you'd put on the helmet, you'd play a little game inside the VR and stuff. Nothing super complicated, but
still
these were
cool.
Still
cool,
dude,
man.
I got to wear my first VR helmet in 1994, and it blew my mind. I climbed on top of a building. I climbed on top of a building and by accident walked off the building, and just seeing this flat green surface come towards me, my feet just started tingling. It was amazing. And yet I'm still too cheap to buy a PlayStation VR. Go figure. Okay. But Ferris Productions, they also were doing this, and they took a different stance. Instead of licensing or trying to develop their own stuff, they actually had a program where they were trying to entice PC developers to make arcade-capable versions of their games for release through Ferris. Now, as far as I can tell, nothing ever came of this one either, probably just because there is no market for this. And this comes down to the idea of arcade games being a very different experience from home games. On a PC, you've got the next 12 hours of your life, barring potty breaks, to play your game. You want this longer immersive thing, or you're going to play tons of different rounds of Quake, and if you get blown up after 5 seconds, well, it's not a problem. You go back into the waiting room and jump back in. In an arcade setting, this just was never going to work. You needed people who knew how to make arcade games. Games where you could pick them up very quickly, you had a maximum of 6 buttons and a joystick, and you were going to be able to understand within seconds what to do. It may take you a long time to master the game, but you were still going to be able to jump in and play this game for a minute or two, and then leave and not feel stiffed. And PC games didn't work that way. And they still don't work that way today. I mean, when was the last time you played a PC game that it didn't take you at least 20 minutes to figure out what the fuck you were doing?
When was the last minute that I actually played a PC game? I'm on consoles right now. No, actually, I picked up Civ 6 the other day.
That would make a great arcade game. Yeah,
make a great arcade game. I'm still figuring it out. Yeah.
And that's
takes
the
you
problem.
forever, and you actually never learn it.
No, you never do. And this is just the sad reality of it. They were going after the wrong people. Using the PC hardware probably wouldn't have been a bad idea. Just look at consoles nowadays. They are essentially just PC hardware. The GPUs in a console today are no different from the GPUs that you buy for a PC. They had the right idea on the hardware front. Thinking that they needed to get the same developers on board was their mistake. And at the same time, the people who knew how to make arcade games, companies like Capcom, companies like Sega, they still thought that they had to have their own hardware, or that they were going to use the same hardware as the game consoles. For some reason, people thought, okay, arcade and console is one somehow connected market. And on the other side, they were thinking, well, PC can translate over to the arcade. They should have just said, hey, PC guys got great hardware. Let's use that. And you guys know how to make quick, fun games. But it came to naught. On a fun little side note, Ferris Productions did actually survive this effort. And they were bought up and changed their name, and now it's a company called Virtua Systems, and they no longer make VR in the traditional sense of the headset, but instead they actually make systems where they're immersive training simulations. So you'll have a 360-degree screen system, and you can train through different scenarios, primarily for the police and military and things like that. It's quite a cool company, just from what I could see on their own website. Maybe I'm just buying into their ads. Exactly. They went over to shooting games. It's all stayed in the family. Okay, so the arcade is a dying breed in 1999, and we've got the numbers to back it up. Let's move on then. We've done the transition from Japan to the United States. Let's stay in the United States and let's go down to Texas, where according to and this is reported in the German magazine PC Joker, there's been another delay in Daikatana. Peter, have you ever heard of Daikatana before?
What do you think?
I'm going to guess that you haven't heard of Daikatana before.
I haven't heard of Daikatana before.
Okay, Daikatana is a legendary flop. I mean, before there was a Duke Nukem Forever, there was a Daikatana.
Well, there wasn't though. Was there?
Oh, there was a Daikatana.
There was a Daikatana. Okay.
And there was a Duke Nukem Forever. We did finally get it 16 years later or something, but we got it. Okay, John Romero, not George Romero. George Romero made the movie Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Dead. John Romero. Does that name tell you anything?
Nothing.
Okay,
at all.
Perfect. So, John Romero is one of the legendary programmers and level designers for Doom and Doom 2 and Wolfenstein. Okay? Him and John Carmack, the two Johns, they were basically the heart and soul of id Software in the early days. John started out very young as a very talented programmer on the Apple. Helped make the first scrolling platform software for the IBM PC. Basically, it's what started to turn the PC into a gaming machine. And then together with John Carmack, we get Wolfenstein and Doom 2. Okay. After Quake, he decides he wants to leave id because his idea for Quake was we don't just want to do another first-person shooter. We need to have something with story and turn it into a role-playing action game type of thing. And John Carmack decided, well, if we do that, it'll take too long to develop, then the technology will be old, and we want to be on the cutting edge of the technology. And I believe John Carmack's philosophy, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, is that story in a game is like story in a porno. You expect it to be there, but it's not really why you're there. And so this was a fundamental split between the two. John Carmack wanted to just keep pushing the tech. John Romero wanted to develop and make better designed game experiences. And so he leaves, gets a massive ton of funding to start this company called Ion Storm. Massive splurges of cash on all sorts of kooky stuff like a glass-ceilinged penthouse office space in a skyscraper in Dallas, Texas.
All the things you need.
Movie theaters for the office and arcades and everything and blah, blah, blah. But neither here nor there. The game was originally supposed to come out for Christmas of 97. We're now talking February of 99. The game has been pushed back yet again, now to summer of 99. And the report that we're getting out of PC Joker was that a huge chunk of the development team has left the company. Now, this was only a 2-line news bulletin in PC Joker, and so I had to do a little bit of checking because Daikatana was famous at the time already for a super delayed game. I had heard lots of rumors and stories about people leaving the game. There was something like over 100 people had come and gone on the project over the many years it was in development.
This is always a good sign of quality.
Oh, yes. Nothing ever bad happens when that many people are turning over in a company. And so I had to try to pinpoint what this was. And this is, in fact, a very important development both for the games industry and for Daikatana, because the group that left here got known as the Ion 8. And the exodus, previous exoduses from the company had included one of the co-founders of the company leaving to found the publisher Gathering of Developers, aka God. Now, Gathering of Developers was a publisher who had gotten a ton of investor money coming off of this whole Ion Storm thing and everything else, and started publishing some fairly big and important titles early on. And so that happened like 2 years earlier. Some of the titles that God developed themselves were Rune and Heavy Metal Fact 2. Well, Heavy Metal Fact 2, not as great a title, but it was still an important release at the time. And most importantly, GOD would go on to be the publisher of a little game called Max Payne, which, in my personal opinion, probably the greatest action game ever put onto a PC. Probably the best action game ever put on a PC, but that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah.
You're going to disagree with that. Okay. Hey, everybody's allowed an opinion. It's a free country.
Yet.
Yeah.
It's getting political
on his first and only appearance on the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. No, okay. So God is doing some important stuff in the gaming business, comes out of the dissatisfaction of what's going on at Ion Storm with the development of Daikatana. But now here in this, the exodus of these guys happened on November 19th, 1998. Again, we're always getting the news a little bit late with these magazine covers. As per usual, it's just the nature of the format that we have to go by some kind of guideline, so we go by cover dates. So November 19th, 1998, the Ion 8 leave. Now, this is a group of key programmers and level designers. They just up and leave. Now, they up and leave already having a contract with God to develop a little game called Kiss Psycho Circus. Now, Psycho Circus was a licensed game based off the Kiss band, but also a comic book series that was running at the time. Now, they ended up delivering an Unreal Engine-based first-person shooter. It was okay, nothing out of the ordinary, but unlike Daikatana, it actually made its shipping date. And that group of developers would go on and do quite a few other games, and a lot of those guys would then end up spreading out throughout the rest of the industry. They started out as a company called Third Law. God gets bought up, changed its hands multiple times. Third Law gets basically taken in with the rest of this, but it is the start of a whole new company, and it keeps God going for quite a while. God then ends up getting purchased as well. You know the story. But the interesting thing here for Daikatana is that at this point, Romero has no core team of developers, has to start basically everything from scratch again, and it takes almost another year for the game to finally be released. It's a complete joke. It's absolutely unplayable garbage. I remember booting it up once years ago, about a year after its release, just thought, oh, it can't be all that bad. It's John Romero. 20 minutes later, I just put it down, walked away, and was like, okay, that's it. Done. Yeah. But, okay, so we got some Daikatana news. I didn't know if I was actually going to get around to any of that in this show, but I got some Daikatana news in. Now, finally, our last big video game story. Microsoft has purchased FASA, and in the process, killed a little game called Shadowrun Assassin. Now, for those of you not in the know, FASA was a role-playing game company, famous primarily for games like BattleTech and Shadowrun. Now, you ever play any of those?
No. I mean, I know that they exist. I've just never played them.
Okay. Well, pen and paper role-playing games. Now, the FASA games had been licensed out to other companies over the years. Most notably the MechWarrior series that was a huge success for Activision. They purchased the rights, I believe, through their purchase of Infocom. They took that over, and MechWarrior 2 was just a massive hit. It's hard to really say how big this was. It was kind of... Doom was for the Twitch people. The slightly older, more deliberate, more strategic people were playing MechWarrior on their networks. It was slow enough that you could play it with a little bit of lag in between. And at the same time, it was deep enough that if you weren't a 14-year-old, you were still getting a lot out of the game. And so FASA was thinking to themselves, why are we licensing out our stuff? Why are we not making the money off of this? There had also been Shadowrun console games in the 16-bit generation. Also, FASA didn't really get the money out of that. So now they're bringing everything in-house. They started their own video game development. And at the time Microsoft buys them, there had been articles about what they were developing in-house at FASA. And it just seemed like, well, Microsoft wants some more stuff for their own game development arm. Because they were developing their own games. They had a series of peripherals, game controllers, flight sticks, and so forth of their own. So it just seemed like a natural evolution for Microsoft to get into the games business. What we, of course, didn't know at the time was that they were already knee-deep in the development of the Xbox. And that FASA was going to be a way for them to bolster their IP going into the launch of the Xbox.
So this seems to be the time before the actual leaks. Before everything leaks.
This is the time before leaks, before we were in an era of leaks. At least I didn't know that the Xbox was coming. I remember reading this news going, oh man, cool, FASA's finally going to do something and we're going to get Shadowrun games, because I was a massive Shadowrun fan. Of course, we wouldn't get any Shadowrun games for a really long time, because what was the launch title for the Xbox? A Crimson Skies game, another FASA property. If you haven't played it, I do recommend both the PC and the Xbox version. I don't even know if a PC version will still work nowadays, but alternate history set in the 1930s with air pirates. So you're
wonderful.
Absolutely wonderful. Amazing series. We would finally get a Shadowrun game. Apparently Shadowrun Assassin, which was the game that FASA was working on, hadn't gone anywhere. It was just basically junk. And we would finally get a Shadowrun game from Microsoft for the launch of the Xbox 360, but it was basically just an arena shooter. Didn't take advantage of the amazing storylines or world, and we'd have to wait another few years until Shadowrun returns to get a really good computer Shadowrun game. If you haven't played that one, I highly recommend it if you like your simple turn-based combat role-playing games. Yeah, you're looking at me like, why would I play that, old man? I understand. Okay, that's all the video game news. There's one interesting little side note that we should bring up, and that is the launch of the Diamond Rio. Now, if you don't remember, the Diamond Rio was the first commercially successful MP3 player. It wasn't the first one. That honor goes to a Korean company in 1997 that launched an MP3 player, but the Diamond Rio is coming Number one from Diamond, which was a very, very important video and sound card manufacturer at the time for PC. And it's also right around the time when Napster and other big services are finally hitting their stride. When the download and distribution of MP3s is really getting into people's imaginations. And the question was always, well, what do I do with it? Okay, I can play it on my computer. Big freaking deal. That's not where I listen to music. Well, now you've got the Diamond Rio. Now, this beauty has a whopping 32 megs of memory.
That's incredible.
It is.
Dude, my first MP3 player had 1 gigabyte. And it was not enough. It was not enough.
Well, here you got 32 megs. Wow. So you got a whole 30 minutes of music that you can pop on it. And it was a steal at just $200 in 1999. Now, I did the adaptation for inflation. That would be $299 in modern terms. So for $300, you can listen to 30 minutes of music wherever you want to go.
Did people buy that thing?
Oh, it sold like hotcakes. Like hotcakes. This was a major appliance that went out for quite a while until, of course, Apple got into the business after everybody else had worked out the kinks. The big problem for Diamond was that they had to make money off the hardware. They never got into the music distribution business.
Ah, okay.
That was really the problem, that if you needed to make money off the hardware, you probably weren't going to be able to make it. But the moment that...
not for long.
Exactly. The moment that Apple got into the music distribution business and was taking a cut of every song, that's when this business really takes off. Okay. That's all the news we've got for February 2019. Any departing words before we say adieu to our fine listeners? Okay, you do realize that shaking your head on a podcast is not really good podcasting, right?
Just putting the gun on my chest, being like, hey, say something.
Okay, yes, I kind of was. Well, I hope you've enjoyed me together with my friend here, Peter, and
my talkative friend.
Yes, my talkative friend. He'll get better. I promise. So that's it for this month. Like always, subscribe to the feed. Follow us on Twitter. Video Game News R2. So Video Game News R2. I had to go with this. They wouldn't let me go any longer with the name. Sorry. You can also email us at videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. And if you'd like to, please leave a review, post some stars, whatever else things people do. I really haven't looked into this. I just started recording these. So I have no
send
idea
us stuff.
how
we won't
to
have a look at it.
Exactly. Hey, send us free stuff. We don't care. Yeah, that'll be great. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I look forward to seeing you guys, or we look forward to presenting again, hopefully soon, since we're recording this on February 28th, so it just barely meets the definition of being on time for a February episode.
But it still does.
It still does, as long as I can get it edited and posted tonight before it's not the 28th someplace on the planet.
Well, you better hurry, dude.
I kind of do. Okay, so, well, with that being said, have a good time, everybody, and see you next month.